I'm Matthew Redmond, and this is About the Author. Our topic today is one of the most iconic and fascinating authors in all of American literature, and the one whom I personally have taught in college classrooms more than any other, Edgar Allan Poe. The word iconic is probably thrown around a little frivolously nowadays, but there's no question in my mind that it applies to Poe. You can easily find him on college reading lists, of course, but even more easily on t-shirts, calendars, and keychains. There are stuffed animals fashioned in his likeness. Heck, he's even got his own NFL football team, the Baltimore Ravens. If that's not the summit of visibility in American culture, then I don't know what is. But the thing about looking at an icon is that we often fail to see the man behind it. I'd like to spend this episode looking for a likeness of Poe that we're not accustomed to seeing, one that is decidedly not familiar to us, and I'll show you what I mean. If you happen to find yourself near a computer or phone, I'd ask you to try something. Type the words Edgar Allan Poe into whatever search engine you like best, and hit enter. What do you see? I'm guessing it's a wall of chalk-white faces, each conveying a mixture of despair, dyspepsia, grief, wonderment, and wounded pride. Some are renderings from Poe's lifetime, while the rest are fan art or movie stills inspired by those antique likenesses. Doesn't he look like a ghost or ghoul out of one of his own stories? If you ask me, one has the distinct feeling that misery could not ask for better company than this man. This is our Edgar Allan Poe, the devil we know. Now try searching the phrase Poe Osgood portrait instead. What comes up this time, near the very top of your page, is the portrait of Poe painted by Samuel Stillman Osgood around 1846. I think you'll agree, this is a face completely unlike those in the previous set. And I mean completely. It can't be the same person. There's color in his cheeks and light in his eyes, and his brow looks quite unburdened. The expression registers as neither menacing nor miserable, but magnanimous. He looks downright kind. Who knew that Poe's face could even do that? This, dear listener, is also Edgar Allan Poe, but not a Poe that gets much written or talked about. When people mention this portrait, they're usually referring to a close friendship between Poe and the artist's wife, Frances Osgood. That alone seems surprising, don't you think? Edgar Allan Poe had friends? Really? Even if we grant that authors are not the same as their works, it's pretty hard to imagine chatting amicably with the man behind the Pit and the Pendulum. And yet, evidence shows that plenty of people did. Poe formed many generative friendships through the years, even as time, circumstance, and his own complicated temperament conspired to deny him others. He seemed to cherish these friendships while they lasted, and to suffer the loss of them almost as a physical wound. In the twilight of his short life, having survived or somehow alienated everyone he loved most, Poe seemed to feel the absence of friends as both a fate worse than death and a harbinger of it. He did not want to be alone with himself. Let's spend this time together thinking about what friendship meant to Edgar Allan Poe. I believe God granted me the spark of genius, but he quenched it in misery. That's how Poe, just a few weeks before his untimely death, explained his life to an old acquaintance named Thomas Morrison Alfriend. From the beginning, life certainly was not disposed to do him many favors. He was born in 1809 to stage actors David and Eliza Poe. He saw his tubercular father desert the family and his mother succumb slowly and painfully to that same disease before he was 3 years old. A wealthy, childless woman named Frances Allan, visiting the Poe household in her Victorian capacity as a sympathetic woman of means, took pity on little Edgar and made him her foster son, complete with an expanded name, Edgar Allan Poe. As all of his biographers have noted, for the rest of his life, and even after his death, Poe would depend for his survival on the charity of others. You may be wondering, what was Poe like as a boy? Or maybe you have some ideas already. It's hard not to with someone known for being so strikingly odd. In many people's imaginations, the child Poe is haunted by the ghost of his adult self. I know that whenever I read about his childhood, signs of sadness or struggle swell out of proportion, blanketing my vision of his early life in heavy gloom. I remember reading somewhere that little Edgar once stood up in the family carriage while riding past a cemetery and exclaimed, "They will run after me and drag me down." And all I could think was, yeah, of course he did. It would be more surprising if there were no such rumor, because that's the Poe we know, and why shouldn't the child forecast his adult likeness? When I read that Poe once told a colleague that his youth was, quote, sad, lonely, and unhappy, I thought that must be an understatement, for the same reason. But it's a mistake to think that way, because this veil of sadness that we draw over Poe's young life does both the child and his world a disservice. The truth was really very different. He was not some little monster, but a lively, charismatic, and intelligent boy who showed both promise and fine personal qualities to anyone paying attention. Neighbors described him as a lovely little fellow, with dark curls and brilliant eyes, dressed like a little prince. As he grew older, Poe showed himself to be an excellent student, particularly of French and Latin, and his accomplishments were not limited to the classroom. He was a strong swimmer and a natural at field sports. He even taught one of his friends how to play bandy, a sport similar to ice hockey. My kingdom for an image of Edgar Allan Poe on skates. By 1826, Poe was attending the University of Virginia. That must have been a tough environment for the orphaned son of actors, surrounded by the heirs of wealthy and powerful men, ready and willing to look down their noses at someone of lesser advantage. But Poe's personality and keen intellect won him friends and admirers anyway. His love of gambling didn't hurt his popularity either, though it would severely strain his relationship with his foster father, John Allan. Surviving letters show Allan's growing disgust with his stepson's spending and generally prodigal behavior. As Poe's debts and Francis Allan's tuberculosis both worsened, Allan's dialogue with Poe swung between acrimony and mercy. Though Allan had praised his foster son's literary talents when Poe was a child, he rejected writing as a career for the young man and insisted on something more practical. Finally, he stopped funding Poe's studies altogether, forcing the boy to leave UVA. Poe, now 18 years old, enlisted in the United States Army, posing as 22-year-old Edgar A. Perry and quickly attaining the rank of sergeant major. He was discharged, entered West Point, and impressed his superiors there for a while. But the poet finally bested the soldier, and gross neglect of duty and disobedience of orders brought his military career to a close. From college onward, Poe's ambitions as a young poet seemed to grow in inverse proportion to his shrinking funds. By the time he was ready to publish his second volume of poems, John Allan had cut off his allowance, leaving him no way forward. Yet that second volume, entitled Al-Araf, Tamerlane, and Minor Poems, did appear in 1829, after Francis died and shortly before he entered West Point. How did it happen? His fellow privates, sympathizing with Poe's disappointed hopes, took up a collection amongst themselves so that his book might come out as planned. In other words, Poe's friends saved him and his career. They did not have to do this, and unfortunately, the experience would not often repeat itself over his turbulent career. Baltimore, New York, Philadelphia. Poe's adult life saw him crisscross between these cities, finding in none of them the full measure of security and acceptance that he craved. Now determined to live by his pen, he kept body and soul together by writing horror stories and working as a magazine reviewer, all the while hoping for a lifeline from some unlikely source. In his last letter to his stepfather that we know of, Poe says, quote, "Without friends, without any means consequently of obtaining employment, I am perishing, absolutely perishing for want of aid. For God's sake, pity me and save me from destruction." There was no answer, and that was how Poe lost his father for a second time. So, how would he support himself as a writer? The short answer is, with great difficulty. During Poe's lifetime, the landscape of American literature was more like a steep cliff with very few footholds. There was no international copyright law, so U.S. publishers found it easy to pirate European books, and therefore had little or no incentive to support homegrown talent. American authors like Poe knew this, of course, and they channeled their frustrations into fiery debates over the essence of their national literature. It was all too easy a place to make enemies, and the hot-headed Poe made plenty. Some of his troubles were his own fault, like his feud with Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, one of the literary giants of the period. Others were the result of his refusing to kowtow to cliques or praise terrible books merely because they happened to be terrible American books. When he wasn't shredding bad novels and poems in eloquent reviews, he drank heavily and endured nervous depression, his overall health never again so firm as in boyhood. His career was often the kind of disastrous spectacle from which one cannot look away. Some people did more than look. Poe's one-time ally, Thomas Dunn English, accused him in print of both plagiarism and ugliness. A poet named Elizabeth Elliot accused him, perhaps accurately, of having an affair with Frances Osgood, severing their personal and professional association. Most damaging of all, the critic Rufus Wilmot Griswold, who was Poe's rival in literature and love, they both flirted with Osgood, fought him to the grave and beyond. Griswold wrote a fictionalized memoir of Poe, published just months after the latter's death, where he portrayed Poe as an erratic, alcoholic monster without redeeming qualities to speak of. Poe was far from perfect, I admit, but this book of Griswold's was a hatchet job worthy of the Rue Morgue or the House of Usher. I think there must have been times when Poe, as a writer and editor, felt himself to be cast adrift in a vast and hostile world. That feeling finds expression in his only completed novel, which is called The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, published in 1838 and later described by Poe himself as a very silly book. The plot follows Pym, a young wanderer frustrated by his lack of an inheritance, and his closest friend, Augustus, on an epically weird maritime journey, tracing a course that leads to the South Pole and finally, probably, somehow, off the face of the earth and onto a higher plane of existence. Long before that metaphysical ending, Poe inflicts images of intense physical and psychological pain on the reader. During the harshest sequence of all, 3 sailors dying of starvation resort to cannibalism, casting lots to decide which of them will be devoured. Even dear Augustus finally dies and is eaten by a shark. Pym's journal places his death on August 1st, which was also the death date of William Henry Leonard Poe, an older brother raised separately by relatives in Baltimore, whom Edgar had always yearned to know better. Poe is sometimes most candid when most imaginative. I was actually talking about Poe's novel with one of my students just last week. We agreed that Poe does a more convincing job depicting people eating one another than enjoying true friendship. If dread, betrayal, and violence sprang naturally from his imagination, perhaps it was life as a magazinist that seeded them. Yet in this line of work, Poe also demonstrated his best self. George Graham, whose eponymous magazine thrived under Poe's editorship, would later praise him as, quote, punctual and unwearied in his industry, and the soul of honor in all his transactions. Steering each new issue of Graham's, The Evening Mirror, and the Broadway Journal to print while hungry competitors shadowed the boat, ready to usurp his role if circulation dipped, Poe became, as his colleague Nathaniel Parker Willis put it, a man who never smiled. Poe must have smiled at some point during 1845, the best year of his literary life. In January, he published The Raven, which was a smash hit. He was thrilled by the poem's success, and he tried to capitalize on it by writing an essay, The Philosophy of Composition, that purports to give readers a behind-the-scenes look at his process. Throughout this essay, Poe styles himself as the ultimate clinician, a student of human nature, poetic form, and how they relate, arguing that words have power as words, apart from their reference, and that aesthetic effect is, quote, the rigid consequence of a mathematical problem, end quote, he volunteers a fascinating perspective on language that wouldn't seriously catch on for about 80 years with the rise of formalism. Talk about being ahead of the curve. Scholars generally agree that The Raven was inspired in part by Charles Dickens's 1841 historical novel Barnaby Rudge, a rambling panorama of the anti-Catholic Gordon riots in 1780. Among the cast of characters are a kindly boy named Barnaby and his closest friend, a talking raven named Grip, that hops around the novel and cries out, "Nobody," and "I'm a devil, I'm a devil, I'm a devil." Poe reviewed Barnaby Rudge twice for Graham's magazine. First, when only 3 installments had been published. Dickens' novels almost always appeared first in serial form, and again when the final numbers were out. In the first review, Poe expresses the utmost love for Grip's character, but he also asserts that Dickens probably stumbled on something that he did not fully understand. And here's a quote from the review. "In fact, beautiful as it is, and strikingly original with him, it cannot be questioned that he has been led to it less by artistical knowledge and reflection than by that intuitive feeling for the forcible and true, which is the sixth sense of the man of genius." End quote. Poe's second review finds his worst fears confirmed. Grip has turned out to be just a funny little talking bird instead of the real devil that Dickens' readers deserved. And here's another quote from the article. "Its croaking chorus might have been heard prophetically in the course of the drama." End quote. Having found that Dickens, the great English novelist, that his vision was sorely lacking, Poe would take it on himself to give the devil his due. And that's what he accomplished in The Raven, using an unforgettable mix of camp and pathos. At the start of the poem, a man languishes in his study, alone with the memory of his deceased love and the books that have failed to distract from his grief. Suddenly, a raven enters the room. Noticing the bird's power of speech, if also its limited vocabulary, all it can say is nevermore, the speaker becomes increasingly consumed by a single question. Is this bird just a bird, a pet belonging to some unhappy master, or is it a demon sent to prey on his weak and weary mind? It would be easy to read The Raven as a corruption of the sweet interspecies friendship that grounds Dickens's novel. It would also be right to some extent. But before the bird makes its historic entrance into American literature, the speaker of The Raven tries to manifest another kind of encounter on this dreary night. Let me read you some verses from the poem here. "And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, 'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This it is, and nothing more.' Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. 'Sir,' said I, 'or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore. But the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping, tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you. Here I opened wide the door. Darkness there, and nothing more.'" Just like in his novel, Arthur Gordon Pym, Poe's macabre fantasies suggest a shred of the artist's inner life. His wife, muse, and best friend, Virginia, was dying of tuberculosis, like his mother, foster mother, and brother before her, when he wrote The Raven. With her would go the strongest restraining influence on his unstable nature, as he himself must have known. The fear of something wicked from outside his study, or else from deep within himself, renders the speaker desperate to find an ordinary human guest, a true friend, at his door. How different a universe the poem would depict if someone were standing there to greet the young widower. Instead, he finds only darkness. For as long as Poe is read and remembered, the circumstances surrounding his last days on earth will remain impenetrably obscure. The facts in the case are few. He left Richmond, Virginia on September 27, 1849, bound for his home in New York. 1 week later, on October 3rd, he was found wandering the streets of Baltimore, delirious and without his luggage. In a truly bizarre development worthy of a detective story, he was wearing clothes that did not belong to him. What had happened? The most commonly accepted theory, according to Peter Ackroyd in his slim and necessarily speculative biography, is that he was used as a stooge for polling purposes, being dressed up in someone else's clothes so that he might vote more than once for a particular candidate. Forced intoxication was often a factor in these election schemes, meaning that Poe's recently made promise of sobriety may have been broken, albeit against his will. Whatever the truth, Poe was now suffering from a terrible fever. Told by a sympathetic doctor that friends would soon be with him, he replied that a friend could do no better for him than to blow his brains out. He died a few days later, on October 7th, 1849. 4 people attended his funeral. Griswold, who did not, wrote a lengthy yet dismissive New York Tribune obituary under an assumed name, saying, quote, "Edgar Allan Poe is dead. He died in Baltimore the day before yesterday. This announcement will startle many, but few will be grieved by it." Many have grieved since, and Poe's spark, despite what he told Alfriend, was far from quenched. In fin de siècle France, his writings became almost sacred. Poe's experiments along the borderline of conscious and unconscious presaged those of Rimbaud and Verlaine, while his claim that poetry should provide the reader with an indefinite pleasure, not a definite moral, anticipated by 4 years a similar statement from Théophile Gautier, and made Poe a standard-bearer of art for art's sake. To Paul Valéry, Poe's otherworldly verse came as a revelation, and Charles Baudelaire could not begin his day without offering prayers to God and Edgar Allan Poe. But aside from the writing, it was Poe's image as the enfant terrible of American letters, weird, ragged, constantly teetering on the cusp of self-destruction, that established his reputation in France. The symbolists, disdaining bourgeois affectation in favor of all things perverse, found Poe irresistibly repellent. Had these men ever stood in the presence of the sturdy, athletic young private, and felt both his charm and his fervent desire to make good, they might have been horrified. Thank you for your kind attention. This has been About the Author, a podcast made possible through the support of the European Commission and listeners like you.